My colleague and friend of many years, Peter Railton, will serve as moderator for today's session. Peter is John Stephenson Perrin Professor in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. At Michigan, he's been recognized as well for both distinguished undergraduate teaching and distinguished graduate mentoring. His papers on probabilistic explanation, consequentialism, and moral realism have been reprinted many times. He also works in political philosophy and the history of philosophy, his early, albeit unpublished work on Leibniz being a particularly well-kept secret until now. I thought I'd tell local philosophers something about Peter they might not know. Recently, Peter's been working in aesthetics, the theory of action, and moral psychology. He has a special interest in the bearing of empirical research in psychology and evolutionary theory on these questions. We're fortunate to have his assistance with this morning's program. Thank you, Peter.
Good morning, welcome. Congratulations on getting here at 9 a.m. on a Friday morning. I must say I'm delighted to be here. The Tanner Symposium is always a special favorite of ours here because it brings together four excellent minds to puzzle over questions from multiple disciplinary perspectives. And so we say that every year, but I think we mean it every year, and we'll mean it next year after this morning's session, I'm sure. Ruut Veenhoven, is that pretty close? Yeah? Is the son of a historian and economist. So he split the difference by becoming a sociologist, at least by training, but I think a subversive sociologist. Yesterday at lunch, we were talking about the question whether hard economic times cause families to break up, and he said, that's what sociologists think. He said, an excellent sign that it's wrong. He has himself been a pioneer in the empirical study of human happiness from early on. He wrote his doctoral dissertation at the Erasmus University at Rotterdam on conditions of happiness, which is something that PhD students everywhere have good cause to think about. And he did this at a time when the great academic happiness bandwagon had barely started to roll. So he is one of the founders of the modern research tradition in happiness. He went on to spend most of his academic career at Erasmus University, helping it to become an international center of excellence, as it is now widely known to be. Along the way, he taught in Germany, Australia, and Chile. He's a fellow of the International Society of Quality of Life Studies and a recipient of their Distinguished Researcher Award. He's now a professor emeritus at Erasmus University, but he's also director of the World Database of Happiness, which I'd urge any of you to consult on the web. It's a marvelous resource giving you detailed information about the levels of expressed well-being and life satisfaction in a large number of countries, and it's done with extreme statistical care, and so it's a wonderful resource for all the rest of us. And he's founding editor of a leading journal in the field, the Journal of Happiness Studies. So its title today is Happiness and Wider Well-Being. Please join me in welcoming Ruut Veenhoven.
Well, you've seen the title, Happiness is my beloved, but I'm also interested in wider well-being and the links. And my start is this temple of well-being, which we've seen yesterday. And, well, you know the high priest in this temple. In the academic forum, there are actually more such temples. For instance, my colleague sociologists have also a temple. And where here is psychological things, they would have social capital here. And one of the pillars would be identity, and another pillar that would be power. And so actually saying this is well-being is kind of misleading. I would say it is what we call psychological well-being. And it's a well-being conception that is typical for psychologists, that's different from the well-being conception of sociologists. And on the academic forum, there's also a philosophical temple. It has many pillars, most of which are under deconstruction. And it's quite a bunch of temples at the academic forum. One of them is, I would say, the temple of subjective well-being. And I would say that subjective well-being is not quite the same as psychological well-being. And I would argue that subjective well-being has not the proper place in this temple. Because here in the conception of psychological well-being, there is positive emotion. But it's a minor thing among the others. Now, I think that this picture gives an adequate account of what positive psychologists are doing, of their therapies. And in the therapies, in the positive psychological interventions aiming at positive emotion in the first place are minor. And there is something of savoring, and there are trainings to see the glass half full rather than half empty. But the main of the business is in other things of which we hope that they affect happiness. So, in this context, the claim of my talk is that there's more in well-being than in Marty's Temple. That subjective well-being, which I call happiness, is of a different class. It's not just one aspect. No, it's more. And, well, bringing an argument, I will first review notions of well-being, then place happiness in these notions, and then explain what is particular about happiness. And I think particular about happiness is single function. And in that context, I will discuss the relation of happiness with wider well-being. Let's start with well-being. One word, many synonyms: health, thriving, flourishing. Well-being is an umbrella concept. And the question is, what is under the umbrella? Well, I have a classification on distinguishing chances to be well and actual outcomes of life, actual being well, and chances that are in your environment and that are in yourself. And that gives 4 kinds of well-being. Chances for a good life in your environment, that is what I call the livability of your environment. The chances for your good life in yourself, that is your lifeability. Chances are not the same as outcomes. You can have had been born in a very good family and be mentally sane, but still bad things can happen and outcomes are bad. How do we conceive outcomes? When you say, well, this was a good life, you can judge the outcomes of life on the environment, which is the utility of your life. But utility of your life is not the same as your satisfaction with life. You can have a very useful life, as many academics have, but produce so much and be so narrow that life is not really satisfying. And if I plot Marty's notions of well-being in this scheme, I would say that where he mentions relationships, I think that's one aspect of the livability of your environment. But the environment is, of course, bigger. Democracy, rule of law, even the physical aspects of the environment. So there's more. Livability is here, that's the strengths and virtues. I would say, well, that is the psychological part of it. But in livability is also your physical ability, your physical health. I think the utility quadrant is better covered in Marty's conceptualization and meaning and accomplishment, though in Marty's conceptualization, meaning is rather seen as the feeling of meaning rather than the real meaning. I would position the feeling of meaning rather here, as satisfaction with an aspect of life, and you can feel to be meaningful while you're not, and you can be meaningful while you don't know. And well, in the satisfaction quadrant, there's positive emotion, but I'll show there's more in this quadrant. Now, this conceptualization, this distinction, that has some analogy in biology. Biologists speak about the environment as the biotope, and when speaking about the abilities of an organism, they don't use the term ability, but they use the term fitness. And that means that not any ability is good, but only the ability that are functional in the biotope. If a frog can play the violin, that's remarkable, but it's of little use. And so the biologists count only the abilities that fit. And when talking about your utility, that is your function in the biological circle, which mainly means that you're being eaten by another organism. And for the outcomes of life, biologists speak about survival, because their object cannot report how happy they are. You can only see how long they live. And interestingly, biologists see a link between these things. Because if the biotope is not too bad and the animal's abilities fit, then the animal survives. I'll come back to this later. Now first, place happiness in this scheme. And happiness is, of course, in the satisfaction quadrant. But what precisely is satisfaction? Well, there are also different kinds of satisfaction. There's partial satisfaction, there's satisfaction with life as a whole, there's passing satisfaction, and there's enduring satisfaction. And this gives us several kinds of satisfaction, which are often mixed up, especially by philosophers when they speak about utilitarianism. Because then they say, well, happiness, that's pleasure, and the partial passing satisfaction. And there's also partial enduring satisfaction. And this partial satisfaction can be in a part of life, and for instance, your job. But it can also be in an aspect of life. And in that context, I would say meaning, perceived meaning, that belongs here. But for domain satisfactions, you can be satisfied in a domain. You can be satisfied with your job. You can be satisfied with an aspect of your life. You think that you have a meaningful life, but still not be happy. And the case of the dedicated academic who spent all his time in work, who's very meaningful, but his wife has left him. So here we have life satisfaction, which pertains to life as a whole. Now there's another misunderstanding that you can also experience life as a whole in a passing moment. And that is what psychologists call a peak experience. Enlightenment in a religious variant. That's also called happiness, but that's not the same as life satisfaction. And actually there is a slight negative relationship, and that people who are not too satisfied with life are more open to peak experiences. Well, when speaking about happiness, I speak about happiness in the sense of life satisfaction. And that begs the question, what precisely that is. Now, a common distinction is between, we have overall satisfaction with life. That is, well, a kind of attitude. But there's also what I call sub-assessment. You can feel good or bad, and that is a reflection of your mood, and you can be contented. That is, that you see that what you want comes true. And this is not only a common distinction in the field, and where this is known as the affective variant and this as the cognitive variant, but it's also helpful in understanding how we assess how happy we are. Because in order to say, well, I'm satisfied with my life, you can draw on how you feel. So here the information basis is affective experience. Or you can reason, am I satisfied? And then you can say, well, what do I want? And what is the gap between what I want and what I have? And then you engage in cognitive comparison. Philosophers typically believe that it works this way. Now, affective experience, why do we feel good or bad? Well, typically because our needs are gratified. And in that sense, the affective component of happiness depends on human nature. In the case of cognitive comparison, we draw on standards of the good life. And ultimately that rests in culture. And so here you see two competing views on how we assess how happy we are. This is the idea that happiness is a cultural construct, and as a consequence, it's also culturally relative. And here, happiness is seen as, well, a product of the flourishing of human nature. Now, the question is, which is most true? And to make a long story short, this is what the data currently tell us. The main road is affective. And in that we are the same as most animals. But there is cognitive correction. And so both mechanisms are there, but this is the dominant. And for instance, in children, this is the only way in how they assess how happy they are, because they don't yet have conceptions of the good life. But in adults, this also plays a role, but as a correction rather than as the main way. This brings me to a related question. Why can we feel happy or unhappy at all? And I would say that, well, that we can feel, well, Mother Nature has developed feelings to inform us. And I think feelings are typical of organisms that have choice. I think that trees don't feel, because for a tree there's a little point in feeling, because the tree can hardly do anything. But a mouse or a frog or a human being, we do have choice. And most animals have very little brains, so they can't really think. And they're pre-programmed to do what is good for them. And, well, when they do what's good for them, they typically feel fine. And I think we are no exception on that. And that affective signal structure is in the oldest part of our brains. And actually our ability to think is a later addition of evolution, which didn't wipe out the affective response, but rather enabled us to have a better look on what we feel. Other than the cat, we can estimate how good we have felt over the last month. The cat cannot. And other than the cat, we can even know that there's something wrong in our feelings. And we can know that we are depressed. But usually feelings say that things are going well, And in feelings, there are two layers. There's the direct things you feel at the moment, and then you know what you feel about. But we have also something as mood. I don't know whether that's typically human, but we can feel latently good or bad without knowing why. And you could say that on the human machine, in machines, you have meters for temperature and velocity, but on several machines you have also a red or green light. The green light saying all things are going well. The red light saying there's something wrong, pay attention. You can see mood as such a meta signal. It informs us when we feel good, most things are good, go ahead. If we feel bad, there's something wrong, find out what, and typically take a step back. So seen in this way, happiness works as a go signal. And consequently, happiness has several positive effects. And that go signal makes that we broaden our behavioral repertoire, and because we are more active, we build up more resources. This has been found out by Barbara Fredrickson, and that broadening of the behavioral repertoire means that we get active, that we open our perception. As Marty said yesterday, if you're depressive, you very much focus on yourself and your problems. If you feel good, you see what happens. And there's also evidence that it enhances creativity. And so there's no contented happy cows. No, it's active happy cows. And this builds up resources. One thing is that it fosters health. Happy people live longer for that reason. It strengthens social ties. Happy people are nicer. And it felicitates accomplishments. Is there also any negative? Yes, there is talk about negative effects of happiness. And the go signal may make that we take more risks and that we are less realistic. And that is the case of depressive realism. There's also saying that, well, if you're happy, you don't read the newspapers because everything is okay. And that you, get hedonic, materialistic, and there's also large literature that happy people are egoistic. Think of the Brave New World, where people are hedonistic, materialistic, egoistic, and stupid. There is also some research on the negative effects, and though this research is far from conclusive as yet, as I see it, that yes, happy people tend to be more risky, but on the small things rather than on the big things. And that's the same for their realism. They are certainly not less informed. Typically, the effect is that attention opens, and we know from research that happy people are more concerned, are politically better informed. Are they hedonistic? Yes, to some extent. They approve more of lust, but they are not typically the heavy drinkers. Are they more materialistic? No, rather not. And are they more egoistic? No, they are not. Reversely, they are more social. So, coming back to the scheme, there are effects of happiness. You can depict all what I said, that it strengthens livability, and through that channel also the livability of the environment. Now, this sets the scene for my question: what is the relationship between happiness and wider well-being? And then I come back here. So this is the reasoning of the biologist, and the biologist only thinking about survival, because that's what a biologist observes. Biologists would probably agree that it's not just survival that indicates whether an organism is flourishing, but also whether the organism is happy and feels good. Well, biologists can't ask it at the frog and the cat, but they could ask it to humans. And then combining, the biologists would agree that happy survival is even a better indication of thriving than just survival. And so I would say that a long and a happy life, that if there's good livability combined with livability and in a fitting combination, produces a long and happy life, and there's good evidence for that. But now you can reverse. If people live long and happy, then apparently the livability of their environment is not too bad. Then apparently they dispose of the right abilities, and apparently these abilities fit the requirements of the environment. And so in that way, happiness is very informative, indicative of a wider well-being. And now my point, why happiness is more, and why it deserves a more prominent place in the temple of well-being. My first argument is that happiness is better measurable. And we can easily speak about various aspects of well-being, but it's damn difficult to measure them. And most of the aspects of well-being, also in Marty's temple, are not subjective in itself. You can also at best measure them subjectively, but there are problems involved in that. In the case of happiness, that's not so difficult. You can measure happiness as such very easily, and it's also easy to combine it with longevity. And in that sense, it's better measurable than other kinds. And what is even more problematic in the case of other kinds of well-being, not only are these other things difficult to measure as such, but the fit. Here, the fit, that is something you can hardly measure. You can hardly measure that as such. You can infer it from the results. Now, happiness is well measurable. Yes, in my definition, happiness is something you have in mind. And things you have in mind, you can easily measure by asking people. And this is a very common survey question. Taking all together, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? Very simple question. And because the question is so simple, everybody understands. And less than 1% of interviewees says, I don't know. Well, here you have the answers to this question in Switzerland. And you see, not everybody is equally happy, but most people in Switzerland are happy, which is not the case in Zimbabwe. Same question, but in this case, most people score below 5. Well, on the basis of such distributions, you can compute an average. And yes, you see in the US, the average is 7.4, which is not too bad, but the Swiss do better. And what you can also do is combine this information with how long people live. This is statistical life expectancy. So what statisticians estimate how long we will live. Now, suppose that in Switzerland everybody was perfectly happy. The average score we are 10. Then the Swiss would have a 78.6 happy life years. well, the score is not 10, it's slightly less. So we multiply this by 0.8, and then we observe that the Swiss have about 33 happy life years. Well, if you do it that way, the difference with the Americans is even bigger. It's a difference of 6 years. But that's peanuts if you compare it with Russia and Zimbabwe. So we can measure happiness, and we can also measure how long and happy people live. And by now we have data on that matter of almost all countries of the world. And the darker the green, the longer and happier people live. Here in Africa, people have short and miserable lives. In the West and here, and especially in Scandinavia, people live long and happily. And you see the Canadians do it slightly better than the Americans. Okay, so that's one reason why happiness is more. It's better measurable. Another reason is that it indicates wider well-being. This is the slide I showed you. And because we can measure it now, we can make a good estimate of, at the level of countries, where are the right abilities developed, fitting with the environmental demands. But in principle, you can do this also at the individual level. A third argument, happiness not only indicates wider well-being, but it also enhances wider well-being. If you're satisfied with your life, well, that fosters your abilities. It makes that you're more active, that you, for that reason, are likely to have a more useful life, and that you contribute more to society. And if I come back to Marty's favorite aspects of well-being, these are all enhanced by happiness. Accomplishment, well, it's one of his aspects. Well, if you're more involved and the go signal works, well, then you're more likely to accomplish something. We know from various sources that happy people build better relationships. And in the case of meaning, I would say that happiness at least suggests, makes you easier feel that you have a meaningful life, which is not to say that you have it, though through accomplishments, probably also in addition to meaningfulness in an objective sense. Moreover, happiness tells us what kind of mix we need. There are also in Marty's conceptualization, yes, good relationships. Yes, we want to have good contacts, but contacts can be too much. We, as we are social animals, but we are also individual animals, and there is an optimum on the social relationships. One of the reasons why the Japanese are less happy is that their social relationships are too demanding. And the same for engagement. Of course, it's good to engage, but you shouldn't be engaged all the time. You should also have your time on the couch and watch television and sip beer. And so the question is, where is the optimum? Well, that's something you can't derive theoretically. You can only see at what level people get depressed. And another thing is that we must find suitable combinations. And there are many aspects of well-being. Take, for instance, the accomplishments and the social ties. Well, a common conflict. And what is a good work-life balance? What life abilities fit with the environmental demands? Well, here happiness is an indicator of what mixes work. And lastly, happiness can also tell us what kinds of well-being we don't really need. And here I have the case of meaning, one of the pillars in Marty's temple. And the interesting thing in meaning is that I think that the effect of meaning, the effect of perceived meaning on happiness, that we tend to overestimate that. Why do I think so? Well, first of all, that I have never heard a good answer to the question why we are here, not even from philosophers. And still, we can be very happy. And so we can live with the mystery. And okay, in empirical research, we see a correlation, and that the people who say they see meaning are the same people who say they are happy. But I guess that if you are happy, you're more inclined to say, well, there is meaning in my life. If you're unhappy, you think, what the hell I'm doing here? And then unhappiness triggers the meaning question. And so I think that the correlation is largely driven by happiness. And the proof of the pudding is, of course, follow-up research. There's not much of that kind, but the few studies I've seen show no effect of people finding meaning and then getting happier later. At least no strong effect. And why is that? Well, I think that there is no innate need for meaning. Needs that are propensities that have survival function, such as eating, sex, social relationships, and activity. And so in evolution, these needs have been installed because if it was not there, you wouldn't survive. I don't think that the need for meaning has such an evolutional functional basis. I rather think that the quest for meaning is, say, an unintended byproduct of the fact that we can think. The fact that we can think helped us to survive and become the dominant species on this earth. And because we can think, we can ask, hey, why are we here? This the same for identity. And because we can think ourselves, and everybody asks, who am I? So it's surely true that this is a universal thing, because human thinking is universal, but it's a universal want rather than a universal need. And now coming back to my scheme, I think that the quest for meaning is rather in this peripheral road rather than in this one. We cannot live with sex without sex, because sex is a very strong human need. We can do without meaning. In short, I'm not the kind of utilitarian who says that happiness is everything. No, there's more good in this world. But still, I would argue that happiness is the queen of well-being and deserves a special shrine in Marty's temple, because it's better measurable, because it's more indicative of wider thriving, because it enhances wider well-being, and because it tells us what kind of well-being we need most. Thank you.